let me talk to you about my newest obsession, small PCs. And I don't mean tiny laptops, although I've always been into those. I mean desktop PCs and small packages. Maybe it is that living in a small apartment is getting to me, but lately I spend a lot of time thinking about switching my TV gaming PC to a very small box. But I run into a problem. Smaller PCs and smaller components come at a premium. Since smaller PCs are a niche product, they tend to cost more than their full-size equivalents. If you try building one, you will often notice that some of the better designed small cases can be priced very high up. A small PC will require a small motherboard, usually a mini ITX form factor, which is also priced a tad up than the other options with the same socket, and if you use a dedicated GPU, you might need a mini version, which also tends to be over the full-size variant in terms of cost. Probably the weirdest of all is power supplies. The large majority of smaller cases will not take the useful full ATX power supply, but rather a small SFX power supply, or in the worst case, a flex power supply, both of which are harder to find when working on a budget. Another option are all-in-one mini PCs, of which there's a surprisingly extensive market. Intel has an entire line of products called NUCs, with tons of different specifications, usually relying on integrated graphics. I have been tracking these for a while for a video idea. While I was thinking of this video, I attended an Intel event where they had this freaking thing, one of their most advanced Intel NUCs, which apparently has AMD Vega graphics, which made me double take. This is an Intel-made, marketed, and sold device, but it has AMD graphics. My immense curiosity led me to ask to borrow it temporarily just to see what this was about. Intel is no stranger to creating mini PCs to showcase their capabilities, such as the compute sticks that show the power of the Intel Atom. But this thing is bizarre on a league of its own. It comes equipped with a pretty capable i7 and a Radeon RX Vega MGH, a GPU that only seems to exist on the sort of Intel NUC. Some websites says it's integrated based on how it shares the same substrate as its CPU. Intel calls it discrete, and it seems to be Vega but with parts of the Polaris architecture there. It's a semi-custom Frankenstein AMD GPU made to work on a small device like this with 4 gigs of VRAM. It has an AMD control panel that is reskinned with Intel branding. You get the drivers from the Intel website. This whole thing is so fascinating. A problem with these experimental devices is that they tend to get discontinued somewhat quickly, which is a problem for the drivers when you have anything intended for gaming. NUCs with Vega graphics seem different though. There were promises of putting these on laptops and never mind, they got discontinued a couple of months ago, after they hired some AMD engineers for their own future dedicated graphics. What is left is this interesting product that is barely the size of a book, but that is very powerful. For reference, I launched both Assassin's Creed Origins and Odyssey benchmarks on the low preset, and both were almost able to hit 60 FPS average, if not a perfect 60 FPS lock. Heck, with a console like 30 FPS lock, this could do nicely as a TV PC for gaming. Witcher 3 was a better example. On a short city test, it was able to keep 60 FPS on a high preset as long as Hairworks was disabled. I think the comparison with consoles is very valid. Since we seem to be going through a bit of a generational shift in the last few months where games are coming out that are making base consoles and a lot of GPUs struggle, I thought it appropriate to throw a couple of difficult titles, starting with Red Dead Redemption 2. Surprisingly, the game's automatic settings tool did detect a custom Vega thing on this device, and on the automatic balance performance preset, it was able to hit a pretty comfortable 30 FPS at 1080p. While this performance is a big surprise, this is a good place to mention some of the worrying limitations of the concept. As you might have noticed from the Afterburner data, the game is running on DirectX 12 and it has several graphical glitches, like in this first scene of the benchmark where something is not happening correctly with the shadows. If you try the game on an arguably better Vulkan renderer, you either get really dramatic graphical glitches or the game just crashes after a few seconds, which tends to be what happens most of the time. I have seen similar issues on integrated Vega graphics on outdated drivers, so I can't help but wonder if this is one of the issues that arise from needing custom drivers from Intel, which have already set this product as end of life. Another next generation example is the fantastic Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order running at 1080p on the lowest the game usually allows, which is medium settings, and that does not look bad at all. The fight they use for testing is by far the heaviest scene I have encountered in the game, and it does between 40 to 45 FPS, which is not bad at all. So yeah, smaller than a console and better in some aspects. The only problem is that this thing is sold at around $900. And that is for a kit without RAM and without SSDs. So there's that mini PC premium, although now that it's being discontinued, maybe it might drop on price, and at some point it might be an interesting option as long as you can deal with the driver issue. So while trying out this thing has definitely confirmed my fascination with small desktops, there is no way I could ever afford something like this. And so I wondered, could I build a small, cheaper, low-spec PC to play games on my TV? As I look for motherboards in Amazon, I actually run into the answer to my problem. ASRock, which you might know as a manufacturer of motherboards, has been making the Desk Mini series for a while, a series of bare-bone kits which, if I had to guess, will say are likely meant to be used as a thin client or miniature office PCs, especially given the presence of analog VGA and the possibility of having like serial cable support, features that we'll often see in offices or industrial settings. There's a GTX variant that uses a tiny form factor NVIDIA GPU for what could be a gaming PC, but that retailed originally for a jaw-dropping price, and it's still pretty expensive if you can find one used, which is not easy. So most models out there are limited to integrated graphics. While I have spent a fair amount of time exploring ways of playing games on Intel HD graphics, most of the Desk Minis I could find had sockets that were a bit too old for the project I had in mind. Until I found the ASRock Desk Mini A300, and this one uses an AM4 socket. One of the biggest competitive advantages from AMD at this moment, which I don't feel gets talked about enough, is how they have committed to just one socket, which means any motherboard with that socket on it potentially has access to a large variety of CPUs and APUs. And the APU in question are what are interesting here, as that will give this guy access to a pretty capable CPU and GPU. As I mentioned before, this is a bare bones kit, so that means a very small case, the tiniest motherboard I had ever seen, and an external power supply all in one package that covers 3 of the most expensive elements of tiny PC building in one swoop, and it was surprisingly inexpensive compared to the option of getting separate components. So that means all we have to add is RAM, storage, and an APU. Storage is simple. There are 2 bays for 2.5-inch hard drives, and luckily the prices of SSDs have been dropping with the introduction of a lot of low-cost brands, which have their issues but work okay for low-end machines. The other option is an M.2 drive, since the motherboard has 2 regular M.2 ports for storage and a key E for Wi-Fi dongles, but M.2 SSDs have not quite caught up in terms of price to regular SATA SSDs. RAM is a bit more tricky. In order to preserve this form factor, it has 2 RAM slots for DDR4 SODIMM sticks. SODIMM stands for Small Outline Dual Inline Memory Module, and they're the small sticks usually used on laptops. While SODIMM does tend to be pricier than normal sticks, which is a shame, thanks to the popularity of laptops, it is somewhat affordable. So getting a dual-channel kit is within the realm of my budget. Worth noting is that the NUC also uses SODIMM RAM, so this is usually the case for PCs this small. Finally, we have come to the heart of this project, the APU. I have talked extensively about the latest AMD APUs on this channel, as their integrated Vega GPUs are pretty capable of playing a lot of games on lower settings or lower resolutions. Now the problem here is cooling. The case has very little precious space for a cooler. The bare bones includes the small cooler that you will see on an Athlon APU and not enough space for a regular Ryzen cooler. Now in terms of the APU that will power this whole thing, the obvious choice is the new Athlon, of which I just did a video that I will put in the corner, since it will work with little cooling. However, the complete lack of an easy way to add a dedicated GPU and no overclocking capabilities makes the 3200G a very compelling option. Hear me out. The older 2200G is no longer in production, although if you can find one cheap, it's still a tremendous device. I'm using mine as a CPU on my personal small gaming PC. But the 3200G has one key improvement for this project: thermals. The 3200G uses solder instead of thermal paste under the heat spreader, and on the original video I was able to overclock it a fair deal using the included cooler, so logic will say that with a bit of luck and a bit of undervolting, it could be made to work on tiny Athlon coolers. Now, this is important because the one other option was using a Noctua NH-L9i cooler. Believe me, I have looked at low-profile coolers for days, and this is the only one I saw that actually fits in this tiny motherboard, and even with that, you have to force it a little bit, which moves one of the heat sinks and can bend the motherboard in a scary way. Also, this is an Intel cooler, but if you have an invoice for a bare bones, you can request a free AM4 upgrade kit from Noctua, which is very nice. This motherboard does not offer much in terms of CPU voltage control, but I was able to drop the SoC voltage to 0.95 versus the usual 1.1, which did drop temperatures a bit while still being stable. And using that, I got to do some extensive testing with the Athlon cooler and the Noctua cooler. Interestingly enough, both are able to keep the APU working under full load for a long time with similar temperatures all around. The difference is sound. The Noctua cooler was super silent, while the stock Athlon cooler made this mini console sound a bit like the original Xbox 360. It was not enough to be terrible, but it might bother some people. Up to you, but that gives you a possible, respectable way of cutting the price point for a mini PC. RAM speed is more important than APUs, mainly due to issues with VRAM bandwidth, so be sure to use double-channel RAM even if you have to sacrifice the actual clock speed of the RAM to get there. I managed to luck out, and the cheapest kit on Amazon at the moment was this 2666 MHz kit that can be easily overclocked at 3000 MHz. Neat. In terms of games, this APU is more than enough to run light indie games like Hollow Knight or Blasphemous at 1080p with full resolutions, details and everything else, or it can also perfectly do 60 FPS at full settings, in which what is unequivocally the game of the year 2019, Untitled Goose Game. Talk about high-end gaming. What about the bigger stuff? So if we see the Intel NUC as a high-end console, our low-end little guy here might be a bit more like the Nintendo Switch when played on TV mode. One of the interesting things about being the low-spec guy on YouTube is that ever since the Nintendo Switch started getting ports of large AAA titles, every time I get the comment being like,
"Why are you doing this? No one is going to play these settings, let alone on 30 FPS.
I can go bang, 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 bang.
Hey, isn't the point of the Switch that it's also a portable handheld?
First, why do you want to ruin my fun? Second, it does at least prove that under the correct circumstances, 720p gaming or less is acceptable for many. And I feel on many titles, we can outdo the Switch. Most Switch ports use a dynamic resolution scaler that can drop quite severely to maintain a 30 FPS lock, so I will mostly stick to that target. Let's start with the newest addition to the Switch library and one of the best RPGs ever made, the marvelous Witcher 3. On the Switch, in console mode, The Witcher 3 runs between 720p and 540p depending on the intensity of the scene in question, with mainly something similar to low settings. On PC, The Witcher 3 does not have a resolution scaler, but we can set the whole game to 720p for really good results. 60 FPS is not really on the table for a device like this, but if you limit yourself to 30 FPS, the frame rate used by the Switch or the consoles, things get much better, as you can comfortably use the high preset, but with Nvidia Hairworks disabled at 720p, comfortable 30 FPS. This is very much over what a Switch usually does, and way more than I expected. As long as you work with 720p, this game does not disappoint. Let's try Doom, another notorious Switch port. On Switch, Doom runs on a resolution scaler that usually sets for around 600p with very aggressive anti-aliasing, and it aims at 30 FPS. Since Doom's optimization on PC is notoriously fantastic, at 1080p but a 70% resolution scaler, the game is able to run at 60 FPS on low settings with anti-aliasing enabled. The 60 FPS lock is maintained fine, so this APU again does not disappoint. A bigger challenge was Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus. Now, I was very impressed to see this game ported to Switch because it is not an easy game to run on PC. On Switch, this translates to a dramatic cutting resolution, which I did have to reproduce in order to get a consistent 30 FPS on this game on our mini PC without having to disable the shadows, a trick that I often recommend if you're having difficulties. While not the best example of what this can achieve, it can at least do it. Let's try a couple of things that are definitely not on Switch to show how this little box can still pull its weight on the recently released stuff. Here's Red Dead Redemption 2. This integrated GPU is not recognized by the auto setting system in the game, so I had to manually drop all the settings to the lowest, but I did not have to go to the extremes of my recent video on the topic. All I had to do was to get the resolution scaler on the 0.667 option, and it could work well at 30 FPS with no problems, while still being pretty acceptable. Did not expect that to work so well. Also, the game works on Vulkan with the latest drivers, and look, no graphical glitches. Since in most scenes the device was actually able to push a bit over 30 FPS, I felt bold enough to raise the internal resolution to 0.75, which is a bit over 720p in practical terms. This mostly keeps it at 30 FPS, with maybe occasional drops at 28, but never quite enough to be worse than the frame rate that you will see on, say, a base console, so that can be easily considered a win as well. Equally interesting might be Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. On my recent video on the topic I showed that the game has low settings that you can access from the configuration file but not from the game, and if you lower all of those except shadows, you get a game that is not glitchy and very much playable. Likely the biggest visual impact you will notice right away is the low resolution textures, and yet it works very well. As I said before, this fight is particularly heavy, and if you can 30 FPS this, then you can likely get much better at the rest of the game, which is still a blast to play. Pretty big win for the little bugs. This is running on a 60% resolution scale because it turns out that you can modify the internal resolution of this game on the file as long as dynamic resolution is turned off, something I missed entirely while making my original video, but that can help a lot. Now, I want to make abundantly clear that I think this is an interesting strategy for creating a low-spec mini-game box, and therefore the priority was a small size for a reduced budget. The Intel NUC is by most accounts an amazing product with possibly a driver issue, but it exemplifies the general problem with most mini PC products, which is that many people, including myself, cannot afford one. So I was very happy to discover a way to build a mini PC that minimalizes the small PC tax, even if it does not remove it entirely. If you just bought the cheapest case, the cheapest AM4 motherboard and the cheapest RAM, you will likely get the same exact performance for a much smaller price, or you can also use the price of a NUC kit to build a pretty high spec PC, but those options are huge, so that's not the point of this video. Any small PC comes at a cost, but I think we have minimized the small PC premium here quite a big deal. If you want a tiny computer next to your TV that can play games, this combination is one of your best bets. And yes, while my main focus is games, it also makes for a great media box or streaming box, some might say, for watching documentaries on CuriosityStream. My recommendation this week is Silk Road, a 15-episode documentary series about all the cities and cultures connected by the legendary historical trade network, and how their cultural exchanges, which sometimes were peaceful and sometimes were violent, had permanent effects on the people of the cities that we can see to this day. It's great stuff. I was recommended this documentary by George from Super Bunny Hub, which I am shamelessly name-dropping because I was on his podcast not long ago. That's right, I'm promoting a thing inside another promo because I have gone mad with YouTube Power. And this is all relevant because CuriosityStream is the best streaming service out there for non-fiction documentaries, which works on a large number of devices, and a subscription that is criminally cheap for something so interesting, but now there's an extra thing called Nebula. It is not secret that YouTube is going through some pains in the last few years that make it unideal for certain types of content, which is why a group of YouTubers, including myself and many others, have been experimenting with building a streaming service not to compete or replace YouTube, but rather to have a different thing for new ideas. We have been uploading our backlog of content there, but there are already original experiments like working titles, where different YouTubers take turns to talk about why the intro of a TV show is great, and I'm hoping I can also experiment here in the very near future. The cool thing is that if you want to support this initiative, if you use the link down below, you get CuriosityStream and Nebula for free for 30 days, and then you can get both just for the price of CuriosityStream. Their support has been invaluable on getting this experiment started, so I highly recommend you take them up on their offer.